Well, good afternoon, everybody. Uh, I'm here today with my friend Jim O'Neill, a brilliant economist. Jim was born in Manchester, which is an important information for a piece of our conversation later on. Jim is a member of the British House of Lords. He's chairman of Catton House, one of the most respected think tanks in UK, which, by the way, Jim completes 100 years this week, right?
This
So
week.
congratulations for Catton House. And Jim was chief economist of Goldman from 97 to 2013. Where he was in Goldman, he wrote a very famous paper in 2001 calling BRIC, which is became worldwide famous and created this term that now became even the name of a bank. And of course, we'll talk about that. But he was the first economist to spot the relevance of certain scalable countries led by China, of course. Jim is also deeply involved in education philanthropy. Was part of Cameron and May government as commercial secretary of Treasury, which is an interesting experience to debate the status of the world today. So Jim is an economist, a banker, a researcher, a scientist, and above all, a thinker, which makes the conversation quite interesting and broad here. So, Jim, welcome and thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Oh, well, thank you, Andre. I'm very flattered and honored that you asked me to join you. It's a great privilege, and I look forward to our conversation, particularly the latter part when you make reference to things to do with Manchester.
Soon we'll talk about that. Yeah. I will start talking about something that people don't know about you, but it's a relevant topic given what we are under, right? This pandemic. And I remember last time that we spoke in Catton House last year, but Jim was explaining about his fantastic experience. He was appointed by Cameron to lead an international commission to explore the risks of superbacteria or anti-microbe biology.
AMR. It's easier to say AMR.
AMR, yes, very scientific. You showed your biomedical scientific skills. And was so interesting, this experience. And I remember that you told me was the most interesting experience in your life, that you wrote a book in 2018, right?
Yes.
Jim, what you learned on that period, of course, it was about super resistant bacteria, and now we are under a virus threat. But what you learned and how you are seeing this pandemic, and we will go granular about this. Yeah,
sure. So thank you for starting with that, and I appreciate that because some of the experience that I have from that, I think, has allowed me to see aspects of this crisis, hopefully more objectively than others, because in some ways it wasn't a surprise. But you're right in saying it's probably, I think I've often said in the past 2 or 3 years, professionally, perhaps the most interesting thing I've ever been lucky enough to do. And there are so many reasons. I could probably spend the rest of our discussion just on this topic, as I could on many others. But let me try and say a few things quickly. First of all, I knew nothing about antibiotics or antimicrobial resistance at all until I was asked. It was actually because of the BRICS experience in my history as an international economist, and let's call it, as you kindly said, a thinker, that resulted in them asking me. Because what they realized was that all the details about antibiotic resistance were known by a very small number of health specialists. But outside of that universe, nobody really knew, or still does, know that much about these kind of issues. And one of the reasons they wanted me was to be able to translate it into economics and finance terms and try and present it to the world, including particularly economic policymakers, so that we could try to do something to prevent what otherwise may happen. And as you can imagine, the kind of complications of trying to do that were amongst the reasons why it was so fascinating. Second thing to say is the reason why it's so important is we showed that if we don't do something about the growing resistance to antibiotics and our overuse of them inappropriately, this is an issue in Brazil, probably more in agriculture than it perhaps is in humans, but it's true in both, and it's true in many places. That if we don't do something we showed by 2050 that there could be 10 million, that's 10 million people a year around the world dying, and that we would lose as much as $100 trillion worth of economic output. And interestingly, in the context of this crisis, many people, especially from the health world, when they saw us write these things, some of them said we were exaggerating. And of course, we had no idea whether that was true or not, because it was a model, and models are models. But of course, as we see, I think we now have the staggering economic loss coming from this virus. And so it makes it quite clear to me that these are the kind of things that can happen with viral and antibiotic risks. Third thing to say is, therefore, it has brought home to the world rather horribly something that I was trying to do about antibiotics, that you can't distinguish between economics and health. It's not choosing one or the other. And hopefully, in the spirit of never letting a crisis go to waste, this will cause many economic policymakers around the world, including even perhaps the IMF, to think about countries' health preparedness more seriously than they did before. Because otherwise, we are going to get more of these things happening in the future, whether they be viral or antibiotic. And it's really important.
Yeah. Do you think more on prevention or being prepared to combat the inevitable new waves or this super bacteria? Or what can happen, or what will change from the crisis that we are living, from what you studied? What we can expect from at least responsible governments?
Yeah. So, I mean, my honest answer is I don't know. I mean, there's so many things about this pandemic. And of course, at the end of the day, it's still only young. It's 6 months at most. Perhaps it's been around, and we don't know. We don't know how it's going to mutate and so on. So important that I say that. But the three things I would say with that caveat is that, first of all, linked to what I was saying, and we might get into this in broader areas, it's quite clear to me that there's aspects of the capitalist economic system that can't deal with market failures. And what we're seeing, interestingly, during this crisis is, if you take the whole market for vaccines, normally pharmaceutical companies, they're not that interested in vaccines because they can't charge high prices, very low profit margins, etc., etc. But when there is a crisis, governments throw significant amounts of money at pharmaceutical companies in order to encourage them to do so. And indeed, a very interesting example, to put it into finance terms, today in the UK, the most highly valued company quoted on the stock market is now AstraZeneca. And a lot of it is because it's leading the race to produce a vaccine to market, which is fascinating.
Yeah, the partnership with Oxford. Yeah.
Right. So one of the things we've got to try to do and to learn from is to find a way of giving incentives to pharmaceutical companies about finding new antibiotics and new vaccines before the crisis. And so one of the things that I'm quite involved in now, and I've been on many international calls, is what's called in the vaccine world, advanced market commitments, or in the antibiotic world, something that we came up with as a term is market entry rewards, where you basically give lump sum payments as an incentive to the developers. And we urgently need something like that in the world of health. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as especially relates to viruses, I don't think, as this one is showing, that you can obviously prepare for what may be around the corner. To some degree, in antibiotics, you perhaps could do in theory a bit more easily, because we know where resistance is and what the kind of pathogens we need to find new solutions for. But these vaccines will have to respond to things we don't know still. And therefore, it does secondly mean that we should have better systems that can cope with sieges and pressures on the system. One of the things which saddens me a lot about the UK as one of the worst countries to be affected, because of my review and other things that were going on, embarrassingly, on the National Risk Register for the UK the past 5 years has been pandemics and AMR, but you wouldn't think so if you look how badly we've done. And what that tells me, translating intellectual ideas into action, something you'd be familiar with in Brazil, with you have some great economic thinkers, and yet often it doesn't translate into great policy. You know, we've got to do it more seriously. And as it relates to health systems, to make this sort of just-in-time inventory management system doesn't work with health systems, because when you really need them, you need to have capacity.
Yeah.
And I could talk a lot more about it, but quickly, the third thing is to just educate people more seriously about the basics of these issues. Like, one of the great things as it relates to AMR is the whole issue of washing hands, whereas in many parts of the world, people before would never dream of the importance of that. And it's a really important basic thing that everybody can do pretty easily once they realize.
Yes. And probably some of these learnings will stay with us, right? Jim, I will make a connection now with this scientific side of your experience with the economic side. Start to talk about global economy. You have been reflecting a lot about this pandemic, and now we had, started the key outbreak was China, moved to Asia in not an aggressive way, moved to continental Europe in a very aggressive way, then to UK, then to US, now unfortunately speaking here in Brazil, in a very similar pace, by the way, than US. Where do you think we are in terms of the pandemic from a biomedical perspective and economic perspective? Because now, just qualify a little bit, my question is, we are seeing the first economic indicators of those regions that left the pandemic or the peak of the pandemic behind. And on the other hand, we had last week, and probably still a little bit in price today, some worries about a second wave, especially in the West, when you got these spikes in Texas, Arizona, or Florida. How you are seeing the evolution or the states that we are of the pandemic right now?
So again, I could talk about this all day, but I'll say three things, slightly contradictory. First of all, I find myself thinking, as the chief economist of the Bank of England has now made popular since last Thursday, that the idea of a V-shaped recovery, at least for the next few quarters, is actually probably more likely than most people I speak to. It's quite interesting, and again, as such a great investor as yourself, you probably appreciate this, that the psychology and emotion of people's minds and economic developments and markets are such complicated things, and our minds, especially with this kind of pandemic, get dragged into strange places. But if you remember back in I remember you mentioned about me chairing Chatham House on the last day of January, the last Saturday of Davos. I was interviewing the US Treasury Secretary at Chatham House. And until I asked him a question about this, nobody in the whole audience even mentioned COVID-19. And I jokingly said to him, yet again, Davos will turn out to be one of the worst reverse indicators the world has ever seen. Because the whole of Davos was all about climate change, and no one talked about this pandemic, even though it was already ripping its way through Wuhan. And I said to him, I said, this is going to be something that we're all going to worry about. And sure enough, within 2 weeks, the global stock markets collapsed. But at the time, and my point is, at the time in the popular Western media, certainly that I saw, it was classic common view that this will be a V-shaped recovery and a V-shaped market like SARS. And then as soon as it hit Europe, and we all realized, oh my God, it's going to hit everywhere, that mood changed completely to the one that typically we have now, that you can never get any kind of economic recovery ever again. And that takes me to the second, which is kind of crazy, because you and I have gone through lots of crises, and we're both still living proof that you can get through a crisis, and we will get somehow through this crisis. So in that regard, next thing to say is, linked partly to my experience from health, albeit not that long, I'm actually a bit more optimistic about the path of vaccine discovery than I hear and read many other people talk about. And the inventiveness and cooperation that's going on between biotech and pharmaceutical companies is something I would not have dreamt of being possible 6 months ago. And so in that sense, that adds to my belief that we could get a stronger recovery, at least for a period, than people think.
Yeah.
The third thing, however, that does concern me is that this crisis has come at a time where there's deep social questions about aspects of the modern capitalist model. The populist movements, now more on the left, are talking about so much. I was just on a call earlier today with some important British political figures on, and the talk about universal basic income, for example, is rising in a lot of places. And this idea that governments can spend a lot of money, something that Brazil's found out the past 50 years is sometimes not a very good idea, is now popular. That it's like a free lunch. And of course, that probably won't be the case. And so there's going to be a whole set of medium to longer term economic consequences because of this crisis that we simply don't know the risks about. So I sort of find myself quite optimistic that we can get out of the economic crisis quicker than people think in the short term. But over the medium to longer term, we're going to have bigger socioeconomic challenges than I have been used to in most of my professional life, I think.
Yes, I think it's a good cause. I'll make two comments. First, I got talking to a scientist that is one of our my favorite conversations the last 4 months. And Jim, we have now being tested phase 263 vaccines as we speak, and 13 in phase 3. Brazil, since the pandemic is very active here, Brazil and US are the favorite places to test the vaccine right now. So we are being writing 5 protocols. The Chinese vaccine will start probably the 3rd week of July. The AstraZeneca started last week with Oxford, and the other 3 protocols will be concluded probably by end of July. So I'm equally positive about vaccines. It's different than medication, right? Medication is not so easy. This remdesivir, probably there are more people are more bullish than they should about the effectiveness of the treatment. But the vaccines, I think, will be there. The mutations are relatively low for the virus, and probably the vaccines will be there. Changing a little bit more topics, I want to talk about the status of economy and finance, but I will start on more economic terms with a more philosophical question to you. Well, you wrote the seminal paper of BRICS in 2001,
It's on
and
my
was still
forehead.
BRICS.
It's stamped on my forehead for the rest of
Yeah,
my
but
life.
it's an amazing call, right? It was an amazing call. Now, 20 years later, I'm not talking about the pandemic or the markets or the economies at this year or next year.
Yeah.
Structurally speaking, how would you revisit the paper, and what's your view on the BRICS looking at the next 20 years?
You know, the first thing I would say is when I read and listen to a lot of the expert commentary about the confused state of the world, or the apparent confused state of the world, and I hear it a lot at Chatham House because of what Chatham House is. We have a lot of international events, and you often hear all these people complaining about how confusing the world is. And my answer to them often is, well, where have you been the past 20 years? Because it's kind of been obvious that we're in this world where the relative dominance of the American model that's been was driving the world for the whole of my lifetime was over. And we're going to go through a period of a much more complicated world where there are other rising powers, China being the most important, that are going to have a relevance. And it sort of surprises me that it's almost taken this pandemic for people to realize that that's the reality. You know as well as I do. Actually, if you look at the numbers really closely and do some simple maths, the Chinese people talk about the Chinese producer still. Trump and his advisors so focused on the supposed unfair Chinese competition. But according to the numbers that I calculated in the decade that just finished, the Chinese consumer contributed more to world GDP than the US consumer. And this is the reality of the past decade or so. And probably it's going to be complicated by the pandemic. But coming to the meat of your question, India probably became bigger than France and the UK by the end of last year, because the rupee, like many other emerging currencies, having been so weak, that might have changed statistically. But sometime in the next few years, unless India is in persistent crisis, which it could, but India will start to challenge Germany to be the fourth largest economy in the world. And so two of the BRICS are almost definitely going to be dominant parts of the world economy in a major way for the next 20 years. As for Brazil and Russia, they have had a very disappointing second decade after a pretty good first decade. And of course, now it's very fashionable to believe that therefore they have no future. And I think the answer, I sometimes joke that maybe I should have called it IX instead of BRICS, with no B and no R. But I think the answer, as with so many things, it depends on good policy. And one of the things that you and I chatted about when we met in London that gave me some hope for the B is that you have, despite the strange nature of the political leadership, you have, at least in terms of economic policy, some focus on trying to be more serious about reducing the structural role of state spending and trying to free up the private sector. And for Brazil to reach its growth potential, which over the next 30 years could still easily be 4 to 5%, that's what, Brazil's got to do that and stop itself being such a victim of the commodity price cycle. And I would have more hope that Brazil can do it than Russia, because on top of the sheer difficulty of doing that, Russia has really bad demographics, as obviously I'm sure you know and many others know. But if I quickly, to bring it all together, if I look at the global share of BRICS compared with what we said 20 years ago, it's basically what we said it would be, because of the huge relevance of China, of course. And I think it's still quite reasonable that sometime by the mid-2030s, the BRIC economies collectively will be bigger than the G7, which is what made it so famous in the first place.
Yes.
Which means enormous, very big challenges about the appropriate model for global governance. But, you know, it's the job of you and I and many others to try and help shape it so that the world can continue to be a better place.
Yes. Well, I think we have all the reasons to believe that this is a real possibility. And just to mention, make a link to your previous comment, Jim. It's quite interesting that in Brazil we have the most market-friendly government, Austrian liberal economists managing the place. And also here, given the pandemic situation, we have a strong discussion of creating a permanent and broader low-income program to the society, which, in my view, it's remarkable and quite positive, right? I think, especially in poor country, have this layer of comfort to this less favorable part of the society. I think it's a must. And I don't think it's a contradiction to have a market-oriented economy.
I must read. That sounds a very interesting and constructive development. I must read more about that.
Yeah, and I think markets are getting more and more educated by that, and will support that, which is, I think, long term, is by far the best for the country. But Jim, moving to you are a famous currency economist, right? And predicted very nice big trends in currencies, which is the most difficult markets to make forecasts. I joke here that when I'm talking to corporate clients, they come to me and ask, well, but where do you think the hell will be by the end of next year, end of 2021? I say, listen, if it's beyond Wednesday, I can predict the end of Friday. What I'm shocked at always about these questions is not the questions that people answer, right? They say whatever they think. They have a model and the price will be whatever, 487 and a half. And we both know that will be everywhere other than 487 and a half. But on the other hand, trends in currencies, they are predictable and sometimes measurable. And at this stage, we are seeing this amazing devaluation of emerging market currencies, or I would even say amazing strong dollar now for a very, very long time. And my guess is missing a partner for the dollar get weaker, right? Probably we have all the conditions for a weak dollar, but we need a partner for the dollar to get weak. How you are seeing the overall status of global currency markets?
Well, luckily, now with it now being over 7 years since I left Goldman, this is something I don't have to think about that much, because I completely agree with everything you said. Quite often when people ask me, in my case, it's often about the euro or the pound or the yen. I often say the euro will go up or down unless it goes down or up first. That's the only thing I guarantee that will happen, right? You know, and the famous Andy Warhol phrase about 15 minutes of fame. You know, it is so true in the currency market. I remember in my earliest days where I remember calling some traders I used to hang out with from in Washington, where I'd told them a week or so that I thought the dollar was going to do. I can't even remember I said go up or down, but I got it right. And I called them to say I'd just been in a meeting with some US policymaker, and I thought it was going to continue. And I went off walking in the Blue Ridge Mountains with my wife. Beautiful weekend. Went back to our apartment in New York, feeling very, very smug and cocky about life. Went to bed, and about midnight, I get a phone call from the traders saying that they're in their office. What would I like to go in? And I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, well, the dollar, actually, I must have said the dollar was going to go down, because he said the dollar, oh, no, the opposite. I must have the dollar's going to go up, because he said the dollar's down 6% in Asia. And we kind of need to do something about it. And we just wondered whether and he said sarcastically, whether we need your expert help to help us trade out of our position. So with that in mind, I think there are two things which I think are that are interesting more broadly. I think, and it partly links to the dilemma of governance to do with the BRICS and the way the world's changing. We live in a world where the Chinese consumer is marginally as important as the US consumer, and yet the Chinese yuan isn't that important yet. And the dollar-based financial system is way more important for the world than is the US economy. And it's clearly not something that will persist permanently. And as a British person, it reminds me of what I've read in history that, I think the pound stayed more relevant for the world for some period after the UK's relative decline in terms of dominating the world economy. And we're in that, whether policymakers can organize a better monetary system is part of the issue, I think. Because I think it complicates life for US policymakers. For the dollar to be so strong obviously isn't great for some parts of their own competitiveness. And then the last thing I would say, notwithstanding how we joke about it, I've always used to have a mantra: don't follow currency valuation models to trade, but never ignore them when it comes to investing. And in my view, when a currency is more than 2 standard deviations away from fair value, I think it's important, certainly with the big currencies, and probably with the Brazilian real, it's important to pay respect to that valuation differential and explore why it is, because usually it doesn't end up lasting. And some of my best calls were when any of the major currencies were so far from some kind of measure of fair value. In my case, it was some kind of equilibrium real exchange rate. That's where the rare occasion you can probably at least not lose too much if you pay attention to it. And in that, there was only one time I have ever personally actually taken a position in the Brazilian real, and it was when the same thing happened, probably back in 2000. In fact, around about the same time as the BRIC acronym was coming into popularity, as you recall. A lot of people, including Paolo Lemmi, our own chief economist at Goldman, he thought I was mad. And he was possibly right. But because I heard that so much and the real seemed so cheap, I actually put a small bet on it myself, and I made some pretty good money from it.
Yeah,
I find it very intriguing that the real is so weak at the moment, because it doesn't, whatever the issues with Brazil, it doesn't strike me as though it's particularly going to stay that way forever.
Yeah, we agree with you. And the situation that you mentioned was 2002, and you were perfectly right. And I remember the call right after the BRIC. It was the first time that the leftists would take over in a democratic election. Lula was elected the first time in 2002. So the currency was hyper devaluated, and it came back everything right into the next.
I think I said 2010. It was 2002. Exactly right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I actually was in a trip to Sao Paulo, and that's when I decided to do it, because I couldn't believe people thought I was completely crazy.
Yeah, and probably it's too weak at this stage too. Emerging market currencies are weak, and the real has a higher beta for that, right? Yeah. Moving from currencies.
Andre, just to mention for your customer people listening. Interesting in that regard. I have people, because of my past, asking me, do I think there's some kind of major balance of payments crisis going to happen for Brazil? And it's just because they look at the price of the currency. I said I'm not looking at these things closely, but my good friend Andre tells me that actually Brazil currently has a small current account surplus.
Yes, probably the next 12 months, since big volatility, we don't know the number, but probably something 0 to 1 positive on current account. Imagine that Brazil has positive FDI, and Brazil has on the top of that more than 350 billion, give or take, of international reserves with not relevant external debt. We are long dollars, by the way. As a country, we are long dollars. So it's a strange balance for a weak currency. But probably is a new adaptation of very ultra low levels of interest rates, right? It's and then takes me to the next question, Jim, or reflection.
Yeah.
We are in one of currencies is one of the key topics, but looking at this 15 trillion of bonds trading at negative rates, right? And basically all countries move it to zero rates, right? US zero, Brazil is 2, Europe is negative. Last week was all-time low of gilts, 10-year gilts in terms of yield. What's your take on this ultra low interest rates environment? It's a new normal. It will be with us for a generation. How you are seeing this new tax to the investor of the negative rates, right? It's a 10-year bonds in Germany trading at 50 bips negative. Companies like Nestle issuing 20-year bonds at negative, and of course Japan, who was the pioneer of this, trading now for more than a decade on negative territory. How you are seeing this new phenomenon, right?
And in the same spirit of reminiscing, I remember the famous Stan Druckenmiller, possibly one of the greatest macro hedge fund investors of all time. Huh? I remember him once joking to me that he'd lost more money trying to short Japanese bonds than he'd made positively in everything else he'd ever done. This is probably 20 years ago. But obviously that can't be true given how successful Stan's been. But, you know, I think it's very, very complicated. Very complicated. But I don't, you know, we've all, and you've been around a long time, so you do, and of course, being Brazilian, you have more memory of the word inflation than most people who are in markets today, right? Most people, what's that? How do you spell inflation? You know, but what another interesting aspect of this pandemic is that it's not just a demand shock; it's also obviously a supply shock as well, and it's not impossible that because of the change in some aspects of how life is going forward, there is more consequence of this very easy monetary policy around the world today than we all typically, including most days I myself think. I had an interesting conversation with my wife just a few hours ago when we the first day in 4 months we go and have a lunch outside at a cafe as they're just opening up again in the UK, and we were surprised at the price that was being charged. But when you think of the kind of things that in terms of safety provision, and it might be like, remember I said earlier about it could be the end of the just-in-time inventory model in health. You know, it might be the same more broadly in that we all have to learn to pay for more for what was the same thing that we had before. And if that's true, then there will be a bigger threat to the credibility of the persistence of QE and some of these monetary policies than is probably widely believed today, including inside central banks. And that's something that I'm not predicting that, partly because I'm not in the world of predicting anything anymore, but luckily, but I don't think it's impossible. And what bothers me is this sort of belief that we can explore more versions of negative rates forever, and I don't think it's a necessarily likely. And without spending too much time on it, unless you want to go more down there, I think there's also a bit of a social dilemma to it, because of course it also distorts other financial markets and may be relevant as to why global equity markets are so strong, because nobody wants to buy bonds anywhere. and linked to the perception about issues to do with inequality, this is obviously some of it which is true, because at the same time we have such low wage growth, or had such low wage growth in many parts of the world. And it feels to me that some of these things need to change a little bit.
Yeah, but I agree with your reflection. But on the other hand, Jim, we see basically all policymakers in the world giving a put to financial markets somehow, right? Leverage up their balance sheets to unthinkable levels, right?
Yeah, yeah.
10 years ago or 5 years ago, if after the crisis of 08, 09. And central banks, where do you think policymakers are? Because, of course, you have a secular drivers of low inflation, right? Aging
Yeah,
population,
yeah.
amazing technology productivity that is not perfectly captured by the indexes. Of course, something is happening that not only a big recession or a big crisis in 08 or 09 US or 11, 12 in Europe goes beyond that, but central bankers are more aggressive than ever in kind of keeping markets under control. And they are being successful on that, right? We went to a global shutdown, and more or less we could declare that we managed financially the crisis extremely well. But and the cost of that, because as you said, it's not possible to print money forever and nothing happens, right? Otherwise, life would be much easier, right? What do you think is this more long-term reflection among policymakers? Is where we are on these reflections or discussions at this stage?
You know, on the one. So first of all, I'm going to give you on the one hand and the other. The first time I'll give you a typical economist answer. You know, to some degree, a lot of these central banks are just doing what is their current mandate. You know, if they are, so many of them have got inflation targets as their mandate, and because inflation was so low and inflation is now undershooting because of the lack of demand, it's perfectly logical for them to do more QE, because that is what they're being told. You know, throughout Europe, in the UK, you've got to get inflation close to 2%. So you just keep cutting rates more, going into negative territory, and so on. And so on one hand, it's very logical, and that's what I sort of was indirectly referring to earlier. That in the foreseeable future, therefore, I think the only threat is if inflation starts to come back quicker than and this time is more serious than people realize. And when you really think from a big 40,000 foot perspective and strategically, certainly as we had in the noughties and the 90s and the noughties, we don't have China because politically we can't have them anymore as this low-cost marginal producer in everything all over the world. So we certainly don't have that influence anymore. And so it's not impossible that as we go out through this decade, another thing to throw in, it's becoming quite popular in Europe. I talked about universal basic income earlier, but separately from that, a whole policy initiative to raise minimum wages. It's something also going on in the States. So you have a number of strategic policy initiatives that are starting to move very differently than the whole forces that were there in the 70s and 80s. And that would be what changes it, in my opinion. The second thing I can't resist in saying, because I also think it's quite funny. I remember when there was a retirement event for Mervyn King when he was leaving the Bank of England, and there was a panel. And Larry Summers made a typically brilliant Larry Summers comment, but it dawned on me. They were asked to reflect on what we learned from the financial crisis, and Larry actually said the reality is about central banks is the only time you ever need them is when circumstances are that they're not trained to understand. And I don't think he meant it really as a joke, but it's kind of true. And I think, you know, a lot of these central bankers are pursuing very narrowly this this defined model and this target that they are mandated to do, but it might not always have the simplicity of the approach that they're basing it around. Another quick thing I'll throw in that regard, I do find myself intellectually thinking that perhaps the time has come to move away from inflation targeting in its narrowest sense, and some, you know, the occasionally discussed nominal GDP targeting, where they have a dual mandate. I guess the Fed in the United States is closer to something like that. May become more sensible, partly as a way of getting out of this crisis, this economic shock, but sort of bringing in more societal objectives. Because even if you go back before this pandemic, the focus on inflation targeting in QE, I think, has played an indirect role in contributing to this growth in inequality in so many Western democracies, and some of the criticisms that are currently being thrown at the whole model. But it's fascinating, and obviously, you know, time is going to be determining some very uncertain things in ways we might not even understand yet.
Yeah, good. Well, Jim, I have one last question about the economy. Then we'll move to a more serious topic to close our chat. The 2 weeks ago, we had a nice conversation like that with your former partner, Gary Cohn. And we discussed a lot about China, where he had a relevant role recently in managing U.S.-China relationship. And what's your take on China growth and China becoming the largest economy in the world? Today is more or less close to U.S., the same size. What consequences, generally, when you look at 10,000 years back in history, when every time that you have a second superpower crossing the first superpower was a moment of instability for the world, right? It's probably is not a military instability at this stage, but what do you how you are part of the British government, right, under Cameron and May, negotiating commerce and so on. What consequence can we expect of these political and of course what comes after that of this China growth?
So my plea, or my request for our policymakers is to be sensible and realistic. You know, at the end of the day, long-term economic growth is driven by the number of people that work and their productivity. So if you happen to have the largest labor force and you deliberately pursue policies that they are going to become more productive, you are going to be the biggest. You know, if you look at the 20 largest economies in the world, and this is one of the great consequences of globalization. And by the way, despite everything, the number of people that have been taken out of poverty the past 20 years is enormous. And we have, on a global basis, contrary to what Piketty has said, is wrong in my view, global inequality has actually narrowed. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. And that's how we all become more prosperous. So American policymakers have got to, at some point, realize that it's in their own citizens' long-term interests that China succeeds, which right now, it certainly doesn't look that America's thinking that way. It looks like they will do whatever they can to make sure they're number one and China doesn't work. And in fact, I find myself sometimes thinking during this pandemic that what happens when it's India's turn in another 30 years' time? Are the Americans going to be just as hostile if they succeed in stopping China? Actually, is it because they're communist, or is it because America just doesn't want to stop being number one? But it doesn't make sense. Think of the analogy I often think of is people in Luxembourg that are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But they don't seem to worry about Germany being bigger than them. And they kind of know that Germany getting bigger is going to make Luxembourg wealthier. And at some point, hopefully, by enlightened self-interest, if we have more and more, I'll use Apple as the example, which is one of the American companies that has benefited so much from the rise of the Chinese consumer. At some point, America's going to have a leader or policy advisors that realize, the benefits of being number one persistently, if it's not resulting in even stronger welfare gains for everybody, why is that such a priority? And I think America's kind of lost on a lot of these issues. It's the same way I suspect British policymakers probably were, 70, 80 years ago when we were going through the same process. But unless China does something ridiculously badly, which of course it could do, and there are certain things going on in China that I worry about more than I've done. But generally speaking, the Chinese, despite their different form of political leadership, they kind of deal with their problems pretty well. And when I look at linking it back to the BRIC trajectory, a lot of people don't seem to realize this, that as part of the profile of they becoming the largest in our mind and the BRICS becoming bigger than the G7, we assumed this decade that we've just started that China would grow on average by 5%. And it seems to me they're going to be able to do that.
Yeah. Well, totally agree. Well, Jim, now that we spoke about economy, about politics, global status of things, let's go to serious stuff, right? And beyond your job and role of researcher, scientist, economist, a thinker, you have the role of fan of Manchester United, right? Where you are deeply involved both in the stadiums and helping to manage this great brand. I have one question regarding modern football, right? It's we have amazing. Well, Premier League is probably the most attractive championship globally. But when you go to most of the regional leagues, even in traditional countries like Brazil or Spain or Italy, Germany, the championship is getting more and more concentrated in the prime teams, right? Mm-hmm. Is how you see that this could be a threat for future football funds? Because what is always brings emotion is you playing with Liverpool.
That's a dangerous subject for me.
That has not been the right topic for this conversation recently, even though that when Champions League restarted, you had a great round, Manchester. Yeah. But how you're seeing the evolution of football and this reflection that I have?
Before I answer that, what I'd like to know from you or many of the people dial into this call is, how come Manchester United, with its incredible brand, has never been able to have a top Brazilian footballer?
I don't know why, because many of the competitors had. It's
exactly.
Probably like you tried once in your lifetime, but need your support in terms of management. It's not that difficult with the Real trading at 5.30. It's quite easy to get some of nice Brazilian football players right now.
I used to joke with some of the board members of Manchester United 15 years ago, or a couple of years after the BRICS thing, that the only reason why I put the B in BRICS was so that Manchester United could finally get some good Brazilian footballers. But to come to your very interesting question, it's interesting in some way. A lot of people have criticized finance 10 years ago or 12 years ago of becoming so divorced from normal society. And to some degree, I think it was true. And I think finance is changing a bit in that regard. And as your question, the way I hear your question, I find my mind thinking, this is an issue for football today. There is enormous interest coming out of some of the European clubs, particularly in Italy, as you may know, to actually develop a full-blown European league that would be a lot more games than in the Champions League. And of course, commercially, that superficially seems like a smart idea. But I think that would be potentially a very, very risky thing to do. Because as I know from my limited experience of Brazil, I certainly know it from many, many places in Europe, especially where I'm most familiar with in England, that, you know, Manchester United and Liverpool fans, whatever they do elsewhere, their rivalry is between themselves, and they're like 40 miles from each other. And if you try to make the British top league of considerably weaker importance relative to some European league, which is to do with distant places, which many low-income people could probably never go to, I think it is a risky thing to do. But it is clearly what some European clubs are trying to push for, because of the problem that you touch on, particularly because their revenues aren't so good from the domestic leagues, and so they want to get what they think sponsors will pay for. But as you and I know from our own experiences, you've got to be pretty careful. You've got to make sure that you carry your real customers with you. And I would worry that if that happens, is a reasonable chance that could be actually soon after be the bubble of the sort of financial strength of some of these football ideas as a business, to be honest.
Yes. Because it's amazing, right? I support Fluminense here in Brazil, which is our Manchester United somehow, right?
Yeah. I'm familiar with
That's a
Fluminense.
joke. But it's amazing how this Premier League or the whole Championship League teams are becoming global brands. And not only Manchester or Liverpool, but Barcelona, or Real Madrid, or Bayern. It's amazing. Right now, they became big global machines, and eventually to get more and more concentrated, right? And the peripheral countries will be suppliers of good players to these, let's call, major leagues. I agree with you. It's maybe a risky move for the overall healthy of football industry that we like very much. Well, Jim, thank you very much for this nice conversation, as bright as always, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you. It's a fantastic pleasure and privilege to be joining you. And anytime we have the chance to chat, I love talking to you and learning from your own thinking about the world. And I look forward to that, as well as hopefully being able to see you live sometime soon.
Expect to see you soon. Bye, Jim. Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
36 anos de excelência para você poder investir em instantes com o BTG Pactual Digital. O maior banco de investimentos da América Latina agora cabe no seu bolso. Pelo nosso app, você faz tudo online e com segurança. E se precisar, nossa equipe de especialistas está aqui para te atender a qualquer hora do dia. Venha investir com quem mais entende do assunto. Baixe o app e dê um BTG nos seus investimentos.
BTG Pactual Digital apresenta Minuto BTG. O minuto que faz a diferença nos seus investimentos. Terças e quintas-feiras, no intervalo do Expresso CNN.
36 anos de excelência para você poder investir em instantes com o BTG Pactual Digital. O maior banco de investimentos da América Latina agora cabe no seu bolso. Pelo nosso app, você faz tudo online e com segurança. E se precisar, nossa equipe de especialistas está aqui para te atender a qualquer hora do dia. Venha investir com quem mais entende do assunto. Baixe o app e dê um BTG nos seus investimentos.
BTG Pactual Digital apresenta Minuto BTG. O minuto que faz a diferença nos seus investimentos. Terças e quintas-feiras, no intervalo do Expresso CNN.